The retail industry impacts everyone, everywhere, every day. My next guest is Matthew Shay, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Retail Federation. Retail is the nation's largest private sector employer and supports 1 in 4 U.S. jobs. Welcome, Matthew.
Hey, Bob. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, you know, we're in Washington. We have a debt limit showdown. People are trying to read the tea leaves on the economy going forward, not only for the rest of this year, but going into next year. Obviously, big presidential election. The economy is going to be on the ballot. What do you see going forward coming out of the pandemic? Where are we in the U.S. economy?
Well, I think, Bob, the answer is depending on where you are in terms of your household income and the way in which you work and live and the neighborhood and region in which you live. We're seeing Americans with different kinds of experiences. You certainly heard Rodney allude to that. Rodney sees millions and millions of consumers every day, every week, and throughout the year. So Rodney can speak to that, and I think did very well. There are certainly consumers in some parts of the country and in certain household income levels that are under an enormous amount of stress. More of their monthly disposable income is being devoted to food, energy, transportation costs, housing, commodities, and less of it's being devoted to discretionary spending. In some cases, less of it's being devoted to experiential and services spending. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Certainly things have changed pretty dramatically from the go-go days of 2021, even the late part of 2020 and almost all of 2021, when inflation really started to take a bite out of the consumer economy, was in the spring and summer of 21 and really started to show up. So I think we're in a period of great uncertainty. There's a lot we don't know. And yet, in spite of that, consumers keep spending. So I think that's what makes it so confusing to try to discern what's really happening.
On inflation, do you think we are heading in the right direction? There's a lot of speculation. Obviously, the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, has been increasing rates, but it does seem like it's coming to an end at some point. Obviously, Wall Street watching that very closely, but that affects everybody. What's your take on that?
Well, certainly it hurts all of us as consumers. Without even beginning to talk about the implications for the financial system and investments and capital markets and all the other things that are impacted by increasing cost of debt and the debt ceiling. But I think we're going to continue to have to fight the inflation fight. I think there's certainly agreement among the people that I talk to that allowing inflation to become embedded in the economy would be devastating. And we know that inflation hurts lower income families more than higher income families because it impacts their share of wallet that they can devote to things other than the necessities and the commodities they have to pay for every month. So I think fighting the inflation fight needs to continue to be job number one, depending upon what measure you use, CPI, PCE. You unpack some of those measures and look at individual categories of goods. We're seeing some disinflation in certain parts of the retail economy. Rodney referenced some moderation in some food prices. We've seen energy prices up and down again. So I think there's still a lot of an unknown factor in what's going on inside inflation. You hear the Federal Reserve governors, voting and non-voting members having that debate a little more openly now about what's the right course. So at some point, the Fed will have done enough. I'm not sure that we're there yet. I think we need some more data to really be certain that we're squeezing inflation out of the economy.
I mentioned the debt limit. We do have a question for you, for each of the speakers today. And this comes from Selwyn Whitehead, attorney and counselor at law offices of Selwyn D. Whitehead. And he asked, how will you deal with the expected slowdown in consumer spending and possible recession if Congress fails to increase the debt limit? I do want to note that the debt limit vote is scheduled in the House tonight. It is expected to pass the House, but you never know. Then it's got to go to the Senate, and we got a deadline on Monday. So What's your answer to that reader question?
Well, Bob, like you, I feel pretty confident at this point from the conversations we're having and the discussions we've had with congressional leadership and others that we're going to get the debt ceiling increased so we can maintain the full faith and credit of the United States and fulfill our financial commitments. So I think we feel good about that. In terms of what happens next, I guess I would sort of paraphrase Rodney's observation that he knows people are going to continue to eat. He just doesn't know exactly what they're going to eat and the way they're going to eat. I would say we can expect that consumers are going to continue to consume and to shop and to be engaged in commerce, but it's going to change and evolve. And as it always has, we've seen dramatic shifts in the last decade with regard to the way in which we use e-commerce and mobile devices to engage in commerce. We saw dramatic shifts in behavior throughout, during, and the recovery from the pandemic. I know we're going to continue to see changes, but we've seen consecutive month over month, year over year increases in retail spending for more than 30 consecutive months now. So consumers are powering the economy. Retailers are working with consumers and their associates and their partners to find ways to meet the changing behaviors of consumers and the challenges in the economy. So I think we feel confident, and we're forecasting this year 4 to 6% growth over last year's retail sales growth, which was 7%. The year before that, it was 14%. So we've had serious growth the last few years. In 3 years, we've had the kind of growth you'd normally see in a decade. So consumers have been engaged. At some point, we think we're going to revert back to more traditional 3 to 4% growth. But even that is pretty impressive relative to other markets around the world. So I think we'll see consumers keep shopping and staying engaged, but the way in which they do that's going to change.
As far as retail, Rodney mentioned that as far as your grocery stores, shopping has changed forever. Obviously, shopping changed dramatically during the pandemic. How has that affected you? And the second part of the question, when you say consumers are powering the economy, from your perspective, are you seeing that in certain parts of the country, or is it pretty consistent throughout?
Well, I'd say, Bob, the way in which we've seen changes and behaviors that were evolved or accelerated during the pandemic, I think that would go to issues like payments, issues like fulfillment, supply chain behavior, a whole series of technology implementations, the use of mobile phones to make payment, for example, and how widely that was adopted during the pandemic. Buy online, pick up in store, home delivery, same day delivery, next day delivery. Lots of trends that were already taking place in the economy that really got accelerated. So I think we're going to continue to see that. I'm not sure how many new behaviors we really saw emerge during the pandemic. There were lots of these trends already underlying in retail behavior and consumer engagement, but it really got accelerated over the past 3 years.
What about AI? What do you see that changing? Obviously, you're big into customer service. There's some excitement about AI. There's some concern about AI. How will it affect your industry?
Yeah, I was at a CEO event a few weeks ago, sponsored and hosted by Microsoft, and Satya Nadella and Bill Gates, and there were probably 75 CEOs in attendance. And Sam Altman was one of the speakers, and I thought he had a really interesting insight. He said that in the near term, he thinks AI is overhyped, but in the long term, he thinks AI is underhyped. And I think you sort of unpack that a little bit, that we're not going to see massive disruption to our economy necessarily from AI in the next 12 months, but in the next decade or the next 2 decades, we'll see AI deployed as we've seen previous waves of technology deployed, and there'll be all kinds of processes that will change. There'll be implications for jobs and careers, which will then free humans up to pursue other kinds of jobs and careers. I think there are enormous potential upsides for retailers in terms of delivering customized, personalized experience and increasing the efficiency of customer engagement, improving supply chain efficiencies, and improving sustainability successes. Certainly, there's potential for mischief with this technology. We've seen examples of that already. So, what we're hearing, I think, from all of these AI pioneers and thought leaders is a plea for congressional leaders and other elected leaders to get in front of this and set some rules of the road. But as you know, Bob, you know, and we've seen frequently, our lawmakers are behind the marketplace. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us that are going to be impacted as citizens and as stakeholders to encourage congressional leaders to enact an appropriate roadmap to make sure that we get the most of the promise of AI without getting sort of the worst of the peril.
And Matthew, that kind of tees up my next question about, obviously, retailers, like so many others, have to be watching what regulatory agencies are doing, what Congress is doing on a number of fronts, whether that's healthcare or trade or labor issues. What are you watching very closely, and what would you like to see D.C. policymakers do more of or do less of?
Well, I think in terms of issues that are specific to retail, we've talked about more generally what's happening with the economy, behaving responsibly on getting the debt limit increased and doing the sorts of things that keep our economy moving forward. But specific to retail, the number one issue that we're hearing from our members about in the current environment is organized retail crime and theft and shrinkage, and what's taking place in many markets around the country in terms of the health and safety of consumers, of employees, of local communities. We've done a study recently published that estimates $95 billion a year is lost to theft, organized retail crime, shrinkage, and that's having a real impact. It's creating unsafe environments for store associates, for team members, for consumers, for local communities, and it's the result of many years of a variety of factors coming together in the current environment and contributing to a climate in which we're seeing really brazen, visible examples of these organized thieves come into stores in particular, but it occurs throughout the supply chain and distribution chain, whether it's along the railroad spurs or whether it's in local deliveries, whether it's in distribution centers, whether it's in the ports. And it's creating a real economic issue, but it's also creating an unsafe environment. And so I think at the moment, our request is that congressional leaders come together, pass the Organized Retail Crime Act, get some resources directed to the Department of Homeland Security to coordinate and aggregate across federal, state, local law enforcement agencies, and to really begin to tackle the roots of this problem. And Bob, I guess I'd just end by saying, if this were a retail problem, retailers would have solved it by now. This is an issue that's manifesting itself at the retail level, but it's a problem that impacts all of us in the communities in which we live, and we all need to be part of that solution.
Are you confident that that legislation can get through in this session of Congress? Maybe it's added to a moving vehicle.
Well, we've got a great bipartisan bill that's moving through the House and Senate. We've got companion bills. We're adding co-sponsors every day. So I think congressional leaders are increasingly aware of this as a problem. They're hearing about it from their constituents. They see it in their own communities. It's really very visible and inescapable to all of us. When you consume local and national news media, you see what's happening. So I think we're generating an enormous amount of awareness about this issue. We've put forward a really responsible solution, working with the bipartisan sponsors and co-sponsors of the legislation. So we're confident we're going to continue to gain momentum, and we're certainly hopeful that we're going to find a vehicle that's going to serve as an opportunity for passage of this and signing into law.
Last question. What's the most rewarding part of your job?
Well, I think representing an industry that creates so many opportunities for so many individuals. We're the largest private sector employer in the United States. We create jobs for more than 1 in 4 Americans, generate 20% of the nation's GDP. You heard some of that from Rodney, but that's true across all the categories we represent, from the very largest retailer in the United States and around the world to the very smallest single unit store on a local main street in small town Ohio where I grew up. So that diversity, the opportunity, the career possibilities, the impact on communities, it's all part of the retail industry. We think it's a great mosaic and an ecosystem that creates a lot of pathways for people. And even if you don't stay in the job forever, as Rodney has done, or some of the rest of us have done, the retail industry is a great first job for millions of Americans. And we hope it continues that way for as long as we possibly can see that.
Matthew Shay, President and CEO of the National Retail Federation. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Bob. My pleasure.